Okay, I guess we can start. Good evening, everyone. It's privilege to have Andita here, who is a Sitecore MVP. She'll take us through the uh, webinar on setting up CI/CD development environment for Sitecore managed cloud. On behalf of Suchennai, welcoming Andita for this webinar, extending my warm welcome to all the participants who have joined. So we are excited to hear from you, Andita.
Right. Thank you so much for hosting me, Vinodni and team. Um, all right, let's get started then. Hi, everyone. As Vinodni mentioned, my name is Anandita Bhattacharya, and I work as a senior Sitecore developer as such. And yeah, I have been fortunate enough to be a Sitecore MVP for the past 7 years as well. So today I'm going to be talking about setting up CI/CD pipelines in Azure DevOps for Sitecore on Azure Pass, and I'm also going to be touching upon the steps that you need to take if your instance is a Sitecore managed cloud instance. Um, so yeah. To just give an introduction here, so this I'm definitely not a DevOps person as such. I would not consider myself as a expert in DevOps, but there was this opportunity that I got where I had to get into an existing project and create Sitecore pipelines or deployment pipelines for this project. And I just wanted to share my experience here because there was a lot of digging and a lot of things that I found, which was pretty interesting. So I'd like to share my experience in doing this. One caveat I'd like to mention here is because the environment was a client environment, I'm only showing you screenshots, which have been, stuff already. Obviously, the client-related things have been blurred out as such. But yeah, I have tried as much as possible to give as many screenshots and as possible so that we can go over all the steps that I went over to get this process in place. So yeah, let's talk about the introduction, which is pretty much the getting started steps and the prerequisites as such. So if you're working on this process, I think the first thing would be to have your backend and your front end builds in place. So what I would say is the first step would be to make sure that you have your local setup in place. What you need to do is think of this as a fresh blank system that is going to be pulling the code from your repository and then deploying it onto this existing Sitecore instance. So what are the steps that you would follow to do this on your local system? And preferably you do that on your local system so that it helps you in replicating the same steps on the server, and it will help you in figuring out what all you need to do on the server and find the equivalence of what you're doing on local on the DevOps process as such. So that would be, the place where you get started. To quickly touch upon the possible backend build methods, I think most of you are aware of this as such, but especially since Helix is the new norm, or it's not new anymore, but anyway, Helix is the norm. So there are multiple ways in which you can get your backend code deployed to your local. So I've just jotted them down here. So you would either be doing it using a Gulp script, which I believe was a part of Habitat as such. But anyways, so yeah, you could do it as a Gulp script, or you could do it using Helix Publishing Pipeline. So what that does is it dynamically binds all of your projects which need to be deployed to this single project, and using a single publishing targets file where you're giving this in a central location, you're mentioning where you'd like to publish, and all the assets from all of these linked projects are published onto your published location. So that's what Helix Publishing Pipeline allows you to do. Sorry about my dog in the background. There's nothing I can do about it. She's a little crazy. Anyways, the third option here is TDS, Team Development for Sitecore. So you can create a separate deployment project from TDS where you enable your file deployment and add all the dependent projects on it, and then just deploy that one project, which will get all the dependent assets out in your as your build output. So these are the three things. One of these three things will definitely be there in your project. I think more recently it's more about Helix Publishing Pipeline because TDS does come with a considerable cost. So depending on however you are deploying on your local to your local Sitecore instance, ideally you should be using the same even on the server. So once you've done that on local, yeah, we're pretty much going to use the same, set up the same on the server pipeline as well. I am not a front end developer. I am not good at front end at all. So I've literally put a question mark in there. Usually, what I do is I get a set of instructions from the front end team where they tell me what commands I need to execute to be able to get the front end assets, and I need to copy that over to my Sitecore folder. And so, where I need to pick up the files from, and I know where to dump it. So that's usually the process that I follow on a local instance. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Get the instructions from your front end dev, make sure it works on local, and then we'll look at how to replicate it in the pipeline. So yeah, these are pretty much it. So moving on to the actual, nomenclature here. In any release management tool, you would find a build pipeline, a build process and a deployment process. So it's split into these two. The build process is basically building your website code, and it is giving you a build output or an artifact. And the release pipeline is the deploy process is going to pick up that um, artifact, which was the output of the build process, and deploy it onto the server based on what you have configured in the deploy process. So these are the two parts that it is split into, and we'll look at them separately. So in Azure DevOps, you have the pipelines, and then you have the releases. So this is where you have your build, and this is where you have your deploy configured. So that is just the basic nomenclature. I'm sure everyone's aware of this, but yes, for the sake of completeness, I'm kind of going over this as well. One consideration to have here before you dive into creating these pipelines is how your Sitecore configurations are managed. So in every Sitecore solution as such, you will have your environment-based settings and configurations and things. So there are different ways in which you can achieve that in Sitecore. The old school way of doing it would be using config transforms. Now, that's definitely not the best way to do it, especially after Sitecore 9 onwards, when roles and environment definitions have come up. But as I think I mentioned, I inherited an existing solution which had a whole lot of transforms on it. So it was easier for me to roll with the transforms than to try and change up everything. So if you're stuck in my situation, you have to, and you do need to deal with transforms. Mm, so just to quickly show you what you're dealing with and how you could deal with it. So in this case, for a given config file, you have different transform files for each environment you need to deploy to, and you have build configurations. And this is just how it was done in my case. So I'm just sharing that with you. Mm, so you have a different set of build configurations available in Visual Studio corresponding to the transform files that have been created. So what I ended up doing in the build pipeline is to have a separate build run for every one of these environments, and um, that's what you're seeing here. So this is a backend CM and a CD build. Both of them are together in a single build pipeline, but they're still separate builds that are happening. And like I mentioned, we were using Helix publishing pipeline. So I just have a single CS project which I am deploying and to get all my artifacts. And you can see in this particular case, it's doing a build, and we have the configuration mentioned here, which is dev.cm. So this corresponds to one of the build configs that is configured in Visual Studio. And that is going to run the corresponding transform and give you the output. It's not a very pretty way of doing things, but yeah, definitely the old school way, and you'll still see it around. But if you do have the option, it's a much better option to use roles and custom environment definitions. So this is something that has come Sitecore 9 onwards. I'm sure again a lot of you would be familiar with this, but this is determined as an app setting in the web.config, and that is anyway something that you don't deploy to all environments. So that is fixed on an environment basis in the web.config, and Everything, all the configuration is deployed without any filtering on all environments, but based on the settings that is there in the app settings and web.config, the appropriate setting is going to be loaded up by Sitecore. So yeah, if you do have an option, it's a much cleaner approach to follow and definitely something I recommend. I know that Camrose Jaman, he has a very good post which he had created back when Sitecore 9 had released. So there's a lot you can do with it. So it's pretty cool to explore. Um, this is something else that you might want to sort of decide while going into this before you get into creating your pipelines. One is your branching strategy. There's a there's a flip side here where people go a little overboard because there are multiple ways in which you can, you can go back to a certain point of time nowadays with the amount of redundancy that we do create with regard to, um, your version control and your builds being stored, your build history and your release history and backups in Azure. So there's a lot of ways in which you can achieve this. So it's good to kind of try and trim down the fat and not have as many, you don't need to really build in that many redundancies. So what I would suggest is at the bare minimum, you have the deployments on each environment that you have going from a separate branch. So that at least helps you to keep things clean and neat and tidy, and you know what is there deployed in which location. So that would be the bare minimum. But yeah, apart from that, it's depending upon what process you choose to follow. But again, it's good to have this defined very well before you get started with this process. The other thing is continuous integration configuration. So this is basically figuring out which builds or which environments you'd like to have continuous integration configured on. So in my case, I can tell you what we did is we just had a separate CI build, which got triggered every time we checked in anything into any branch. So just to say that your your branch is it's successfully building, and we had a CI build even on running on develop, and it deployed it did the deployment as well automatically. But in the same case, in production, when you did a merge into the production branch, we wanted a little bit more control where we wanted to trigger it only manually when we need it. So this is something that you might want to think about and decide before going into the process, but it's pretty much configurations as such, so it's not that hard to change. But it's still good to know, and going in instead of getting to the point where you're changing all the configurations and in the end nobody knows what is actually there in place without going and looking. So that's why I'm specifically calling out these two things to plan before you start building your pipelines. So yeah, this we saw. Let's get into actually creating the pipeline. So you're doing this, like I mentioned, I think I'm talking about Azure DevOps here. So you have different ways of doing it, obviously in TFS and things like that, if you're following using, Jenkins or anything like that. But yeah, we're going over DevOps today. So in DevOps, you create a new pipeline. It asks you to connect to your repository, and you can choose which repository you have your code on. In my case, it was in Azure itself. Um, Something to note here is that by default, it's going to give you this option where you can configure your pipeline in YAML, which is sort of a scripting syntax for your pipelines in this case. But unless you're overly familiar with YAML, I wouldn't recommend that you deal with YAML. It's a little difficult to read and uh, even harder to edit and maintain. Mm, Unless you're familiar. If you're familiar with it, then nothing like it. But if like me, it's the first time you're getting into these things, it's much easier to use this visual editor that is available. So that's what I've highlighted here. Use the classic editor, so it'll give you a visual GUI. So I find that much easier to deal with. So when you're creating the pipeline, you will have to choose what branch the pipeline is going to fetch the code from. So, and for each branch that you're building with, it will be a separate pipeline as such. So the next thing you do is based on the repository that you've selected, it will give you a bunch of templates. And based on the kind of code that you have, it's actually a little intelligent, and it gives you the possible templates accordingly. And yeah, you can choose one of these. I just go with the empty job. And then you create the tasks that you want to get done in a sequential manner as a part of the build pipeline. So you can just search for tasks. My search bar is missing. It's in the side here, which is got cropped. But anyways, you can search for tasks, things like NuGet restore and do an MS build and stuff like that. You can search for those and select those and add it here. So we look at a sample which is already configured. So this is a build that we had configured on our end. So you can see that here, these steps are pretty similar to something that you would do manually if you tried to set up vanilla local build on your system. So what we're doing is in this is we are doing a NuGet install, and here it's going to take the package sources that you have configured in the NuGet.config. So typically in a Sitecore solution, you would have a pointer to the Sitecore NuGet feed and the regular Microsoft feed as well, in addition to that. And once you've set the NuGet package sources, then you do a NuGet restore and you do a build. So I'm doing a build of a single project here again. And what we are trying to achieve out of this build process is to get the build output, which is the build artifacts. So you can see here that in the MS build arguments, we've given the publish location as a variable which is available by Microsoft in to use in Azure DevOps pipelines. Just to yeah, this is actually the location where you can see very nice documentation about all the variables that are available to you while using Azure pipelines. So this is something that's good to know. So coming back here, we are using the artifact staging directory to push the build output. And in the last step, what you need to do is make sure that this build artifact as such is pushed onto a location where the deploy process can access the artifacts. So in this case, we're moving it to the Azure pipelines. So that's what you see here. So when you do a publish, you're picking up the build artifacts from this artifact staging directory, which is where we stored it in the previous step, and then push it onto Azure pipelines. And then in the release process, we're going to give the source location as Azure pipelines and mention this artifact name. So it will know what it's looking for and pick that up and then deploy based on how we configure it. So that's about the um, build process. And we spoke about continuous integration as such. So that can be configured here in the triggers tab of the build. So you can choose that you can choose to enable continuous integration based on whenever anything is checked into a particular branch. You can also schedule builds if you'd like, in case someone checks in something and cancels the build. So you have something scheduled anyhow on a daily basis or whatever interval you'd like, just to make sure that your build is not broken. So that's where you would do this. Now you have the build in place and you kicked off the build. How do you validate that your build is good and it's actually working as you intended to? So what you do is you look at a particular, so you've executed the build pipeline as such. So you go into one of those instances and in the bottom, you'll see this list of jobs. Now these jobs yeah, correspond to these jobs that you're seeing here in the build pipeline. So I had two jobs with multiple tasks in them. So QA, backend, CM, and CD. So in the output, once the build is run, I do see that these two jobs are available. Go into any one of them. You'll get to see the actual steps that were performed, which correspond to the ones that we had configured in the previous screen. And you also get to see the artifact that was created. So when you go into the artifact, you can actually see each file, as in whatever is a part of the build output, all the files are visible. And this is a good place for you to validate that, especially when you've used things like build configuration to make sure that your config was transformed correctly. So this is a good place to go in and check that what you need is exactly what is gotten produced here. So that's that. A quick glance here on a front-end pipeline. Like I mentioned, don't ask me questions on this. I literally get steps from the front end team and make sure that all of that is translated into the build. Why I have included the screenshot is to sort of tell you that almost all the regular kind of things that front end will ask you to execute, things like node install and npm and gulp and grunt. You have Microsoft tasks for each of these, so it's good to use these instead of just using command line tasks for everything, because you can see it visually as well, and I have seen different results in some cases as well. So it's nice if you're running a gulp command as such. So use the inbuilt the available Microsoft gulp tasks. So um, it's good that everything is available here as well. You don't have to use any third-party ones. They are all Microsoft available tasks. So let's get into the release pipeline. So once I have the build pipeline in place, we saw the artifact and we verified the artifact. Now what we need to do is configure picking up this artifact and deploying it onto the server. So coming back to your Azure DevOps, you have the releases section. You can create a new release pipeline. It gives you a bunch of options. I choose to go with empty job, and you can explore all the rest. There's a whole lot of things here available. But anyways, I choose to go with the empty job. Now you have two sections here. One is the artifacts and the stages. So in the artifacts, you're going to configure what is the input that you're providing to this deployment process. So in my case, I had two builds that were happening separately, and that was mainly because my front end and back end repositories were separate. So I have two different builds for my front end and back end. So those are the artifacts that I will select here. And so I select a source build and I say that, yeah, these are the artifacts that are coming out of this build. These are your input. And in the stages, I will configure that now take this input and deploy it in this location that I'm going to mention in the stages. So that's pretty much what we are doing with release pipelines. So to show this to you, here is where you're adding an artifact. You will select a build pipeline that you have configured, and it will show you what are the artifacts that are available as a part of this build pipeline. And this is going to happen. So ideally, you would have executed your build at least once. So based on that, it's going to actually show you these values. And then you can try to add a stage. Stages are also similar. You're basically adding tasks to stages, and you can search for different tasks. And for the purpose of this demo, we're going to, or this presentation rather, we're going to talk about Azure App Service Deploy, because like I mentioned that um, the solution I had was hosted on Sitecore Managed Cloud, and it's on Azure PaaS. So we're going to deploy to an app service in this case. So at this point, I need to have a connection between my Azure DevOps and the app service that I'm trying to deploy to. And since this was hosted in Sitecore Managed Cloud, there was an additional step that I needed to do to be able to establish this connection between my DevOps and the web app. So what you actually need some additional information from Sitecore in this case, and which can be got from them using a Sitecore support ticket. So if you did get into a project which is being hosted by Azure by Sitecore Managed Cloud, you would get you would ideally have support access. So that's what I'm going to show you now. You need to create a service request. So it's not a support case, it's a service request. So you go into access management and you have a get access to Azure Service Principal. So this is the kind of service request that you need to create. You go in and fill in your account. So your account should ideally be associated with this client already. And that's it. You raise this request, fill in the stuff, and raise the request. You pretty much get a immediate response like in under an hour from Sitecore, because I think it's an automated process. I'm not sure, but yeah, every time I've done this, it's come back fairly quick. So they send you a whole bunch of information that you need to use to establish that connection between DevOps and the web app. There was actually it was a little bit confusing because there was a whole there as you can see there are a whole lot of IDs that they send, and the names don't really match up what you're meant to meant to enter in DevOps. So yeah, I'll just give you a clear visual of that. But yeah, this is the kind of response that you'll get from Sitecore. And then you go into your DevOps, go to project settings, and try to create a service connection. So there you choose Azure Resource Manager. And these, I know there's a lot of steps here. So I will share this presentation as well. And I'm hoping to get all this out in blogs as well. So that it's helpful for people who are trying to do this for the first time. I had to, yeah, dig around quite a bit to get all this information, but yeah, I'll try to get the blogs out there. So yeah, you select Azure Resource Manager, go to Service Principal, Manual, and then this is the form that you get, which you need to fill in. And the subscription ID and the subscription name, these are some things that you should have access to from Azure portal itself. And these three fields are the ones that you're going to be filling in from the response that you got from Sitecore. So as you can see, the names are not exactly matching in these two cases. I tried, yeah, I actually it took me a couple of days because I kept entering the wrong combination of IDs from their response. But the service principal response is meant to be the application client ID, and your service principal key is meant to be the service principal password or API key, and tenant ID is thankfully tenant ID. So once you've entered all this information, so you're setting up the subscription name. So in my case, I had to do it for each environment. I had to add a separate service connection for each environment. Once you've added all this, say verify, and that's it. You've saved your new service connection. So when you're trying to deploy your code, you will have to select this new service connection that you have deployed, that you have just created. So where you do that, coming back to the deployment pipeline or the release pipeline. So when you create the release pipeline, each stage um, can have, sorry, each stage can need one or more of the artifacts that you initially built into the process. Let me Did I show you? Okay. Yeah, the stuff that comes up in this artifact section here. So those are the ones. I have one later. Hang on. Yeah. So based on the um, input builds that you have configured, you'll have the list of artifacts that are available to you, and you can select one or more of those. So how you would choose that is, in this case, see, I'm deploying to CD, so I just need the CD artifact. I don't need the CM artifact, and you'd want to select this carefully, because this is going to determine how much time it takes. It's going to help if you select only what you need, because it downloads these artifacts from the pipeline, and it takes forever if you have it you have everything, unneeded artifacts as well selected. Like when you're trying to do an app service restart, you don't need any artifacts at all, so you don't need to waste time downloading it. So it's good to determine and select just what you need, and then in the app service deploy as such. So this is how we have the deploy, and this is where I'm selecting um, the service connection that I just created. I showed you like 2 steps back. So the connection type is Azure Resource Manager, and in the Azure subscription, you will get the list of service connections that you've created in Azure DevOps. And then you select your service name, and it's a list where you select from. And in case you're deploying to a slot, then you need to uh, give this additional information as well. And we'll talk about slots in a bit. But yeah, this is another important thing. So this is where you're saying that you're giving it the source, that where in the artifact, in the build artifact, which folder or the contents of which folder am I copying into or deploying onto the server. And this is going to correspond with what we saw in the artifacts. Eh, Yeah. So in this case, you see the artifacts here. So here you have like folder names and the path that is available here. So this path is going to correspond to the path that you configure in the app service deployment task. So going back to that, yeah. So the folder is the name has to obviously match what we had in the artifact, and this is also going to show up as a tree actually, where you can select the folder that you'd like to deploy. By default, it's going to deploy this to the web root of your server. Now, in case you want to deploy something to a different folder, which is the case in case of front-end assets. So you don't want front-end assets typically deployed to your web root. Sometimes you might have that situation, which was the scenario in my case. So I needed to deploy it into a different folder called assets within the web root. So how do I determine that? That's where I can set in the virtual application. So to be able to mention or specify a virtual application, which is basically a location to deploy the artifacts in, apart from the root folder as such. So you need to create the virtual application. Um, this is pretty much how you'd create, virtual directories in IIS as such, but in this case, there's no IIS because it's an app service, so you create it here. So in the app service, you go into configuration, path mappings, and uh, go to the new virtual application or directory, and then you have to give the virtual path and point it to a actual folder, and the directory is usually checked by default, so uncheck this, and that's it. You'll have a new virtual application. So the path that you configure here in the virtual path is what you will enter here in the virtual application. And this is what you need to use if you're not deploying to your root folder and you'd like to deploy to a different folder as such in the file system. Now we look at a sample release pipeline, and this I'm not saying is a best practice as such. It's just something that after multiple tries is something I landed on, and I think it does work pretty well. So I just want to show that to you. So in this case, you can see that we have the artifacts column where we have the build artifacts coming in from two different builds, so the backend and the front end build. So these are the artifacts that are available for this deployment process. And in the stages, you can see there are two lines here for CM and CD. So yeah, going back to, I don't want to curse the transforms anymore because I've done that. So anyways, because of that, I had to split it out. And deployment, yeah, I guess deployment anyway, I would want to do it separately because we have different app services. But anyhow, it's pretty much the same process. On CM, I just had to add a step for restarting CM because um, I was facing issues with CM coming up without a restart. It wasn't really coming up. So a restart helped in that case. So otherwise, they're pretty much the same. So we're just going to look at the CD flow here. So this is an example of a zero downtime deployment. So just to walk you through the process here, we used deployment slots in this case. So what is a deployment slot? It's basically a clone of an app service or a secondary app service. You can associate it with any given app service. In this case, I've done it for both my CM and CD app services. So I've created a secondary slot, and I'll show you where to do that as well. And we have cloned that from the primary app service. So once you have that in place, what we are doing during the deployment process is that we start the CD slot. It's usually stopped because you don't want it eating resources at other times. You just need it during the deployment for the zero downtime, experience as such. So you start the secondary slot, you deploy your resources to the secondary slot. So all of this is happening to the secondary slot. And then you warm up the secondary slot. We're going to talk about this as well, this warm up task, because I think that was a pretty cool thing that I found. So I'll just talk about that. And this secondary slot also has a URL of its own, using which you can directly hit the secondary website as such. So what I've done here, and you can see this tiny little tick mark here next to this person on the screen. So this is where I've configured an approval process because I don't want this entire thing to go without any manual intervention. This is a production release. So I am deploying to the secondary slot and doing a warm up. So my deployment to the secondary slot is complete. Nothing has touched my production yet, as in the main production app service. So at this point, I've added an approval step. So it's going to come here and wait for me to click a button and approve. So at this point, I can go in, I can explore the site on the secondary slot URL using that and check that all my deployment went through correctly. Things are working fine. So you can do all of that. And once you're satisfied with it, then you can approve it. And in the last step, it does the swap. And I think after that, I'm even stopping the secondary slot because I don't want it running simply. So that is the process that we have set up to get a zero downtime deployment in this case. And we'll look at a little bit more of the details of this setup as well. So a lot of these steps, like the starting a slot and swapping and stopping the slot. So all of these are management tasks as such, and you don't need any of these artifacts. So make sure that you uncheck them for these kind of stages that you have. So here's what that looks like. So this uses an app service, Azure App Service Manage task. So it allows you to configure all of these things. So in the action, you can select whether you'd like to swap the slots and start and stop and restart slots, or restart an app service. So you can choose what action you'd like to do here. So it's a pretty useful task here. So in this case, I'm swapping the slots. I give the app service name, and I also mention which slot I'm trying to swap it with, swap it production. So this is what I have in place for swapping, and you can see that I also have a step for stopping the secondary slot after the swap is completed. Now, setting up the deployment slots. When you want to create the deployment slots, you just go into the actual app service, the primary app service, and you have the deployment slots option here. You can add a new slot. You can swap it out manually if you'd like, but in my case, it's anyway a part of the process as such. But um, so I can add a new slot here. And something to note is when I create a new slot, it's not like all the files are getting copied over from this primary app service. It's a blank slate. And I definitely don't want to go and start installing Sitecore there, because all I want is to clone this primary app service onto it, and I need to get Sitecore up and running on the secondary slot before I start using it for the build process or for the deployment. So the best way to do that, as I have found, is to restore it from a given backup of this primary app service. So since I was using Sitecore Managed Cloud, the backups were already in place. But in case you don't have one, you can just manually trigger a backup of your app service, and that will give you a custom backup, and you can restore from that. So you usually have these restore icons over here under the blade. So yeah, when you click on the restore icon, this blade comes in, and then you can select which slot you want to restore onto. So this is a backup of the primary slot that you are trying to restore onto the secondary slot that you have created. And just a note of caution here, do not use any of these automatic backups. It doesn't work. I have had to, I got burned a couple of times with that. But yeah, use a custom backup if you don't have one happening, one scheduled, as in by this backup schedule. So just do a complete backup on your own, and then restore from that. So you'll want to make sure that your Sitecore is running. The only change I had to make was to make sure that the URL of the secondary slot was also configured in site definition, just so that Sitecore loads up. So that's the only change you'll have to do from a code perspective after you have done this restore. So this restore is going to make sure that all the files are cloned onto the secondary slot that we created. Um, we spoke about we spoke about this approval process that I had in place. If you wanted to put a pause in the deployment process for any reason, so this is where you'll do that. So in any stage, you have these icons on as pre, and on this side it is post deployment. Things that you can configure. So in this case, we're just looking at the pre-deployment. So you can set up approvals in this way. You can set up delays if you'd like to for whatever reason. And this flowchart kind of thing that you actually saw, this is not something that we are creating by doing, drag and drop as such. It happens based on the triggers that you configure for each stage. So in this case, the swap CM slot stage, it has a trigger as this should get triggered after the warm-up CM. So that's why this is the way it has been drawn over here in the visual representation. So based on stuff that you configure in the triggers, you get this diagram generated. And stuff that is right in the beginning and happens as the first step, in that case you're going to say that the trigger is immediately after the release. So when you have trigger the release, then that is the first step going in. So that's how you configure the flow here. If you and you can select multiple stages here, so you'll get that kind of flow chart where you have it waits for all the stages that you have mentioned here to get completed to only after that do this current stage. So that's how you're going to create this kind of flow diagram. So a quick note about the marketplace task, and this is the warm-up step that I spoke about, this warm-up CM. So I just wanted to add a note here because, yeah, I got stuck in this as well. I wanted to add this marketplace task that is available for kicking off smoke tests. But when I hit this and went to get it free, it gave me a 500 error. I kept thinking there was something wrong with this marketplace task, but I was actually lacking the access. So if you run into something like that, you pretty much have to go to your admin and ask for access. Once you do have access, you'll reach this page where it will give you the list of Azure DevOps projects you are a part of. So you can add a given marketplace task to that project, and this task will be available for any pipelines within that project. So that's how you would add it. And just to give a quick note about this task, because I found it very useful for myself. So what it does is it allows you to select or to configure multiple URLs, and you could probably choose the home page um, uh, and any other pages which are more important to your business. You could select a bunch. You could add a bunch of links in it, and then you could tell it how many times um, you would like to configure that it hits those links. So this is something you're basically configuring after a build, so that it loads up these pages till it tries to load these pages till it gets a 200 response. So the initial delay that we or the slowness that we see after a build, that is something that you are not trying to refresh and getting a 503 error and trying to refresh and biting your nails off. You don't have to do all of that manually, because this task is going to take care of it. You would configure the URLs, you would configure how many times you would like it to try. So it tries that many times or until it gets a 200, and what interval you want to configure between each retry. So that is something that you can set up in this task. I found it very useful. Before that, yeah, it was very nerve-wracking sitting and waiting to see if the site is going to load up or not. So that's about adding marketplace tasks to your DevOps project as such. So this was pretty much what I had in mind to share with you today, and this is what I had worked on, and based on my experience. Like I mentioned right in the beginning, I'm not promising that this is all the best practice. It's just based on experience, what I have done in place and how it has worked out for me. If there's a better way of doing things, any suggestions anyone can have on this, just feel free to reach out to me, and I would definitely like to hear about them. So if there are any questions at this time, I can take any. I don't promise I'll be able to answer them right away, but I'll definitely make an effort to find out about them.
Thanks, Anudita. Any question, guys? No. So we have clearly explained it's a basic differences.
Nice, I got off easy.
So thanks a lot, Anudita. Thanks for your timing. Thanks
Sure.
for
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for hosting me.